Hey, classic ladies. Today we're gonna dish the scoop. So grab a cup of water, or if you want to be a little wild, put a spritz of lemon and just let's chat. Let's chat just like we're friends, by which I mean you shut up and I talk the whole time. That's what it's like to be friends with me in real life. So, oh my God, did you watch Oprah interview that whore, Meghan Markle? I hate Meghan Markle so much, and I'll tell you why. She never responded to my offer generously for free to sing at her wedding. I'm an opera singer. Hello. Hello, Hava Nagila, wedding song, opera singer, me, classic song. Even if you aren't Jewish, hello. The fuck? I said soy, not almond milk. Soy. Can't those Starbucks baristas, a.k.a. glorified fast food workers, get anything right? God, poor people are so stupid. I know I say abortion is wrong, but maybe if you're too dumb to make a fucking latte correctly, you shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. So that's today's scoop: forced sterilization for the poor. Oh, God, no. Oh, my God. It's been 60 seconds and I cannot stand myself. There's no way I can't do this.
What the fuck was that?
Hey, this segment is back. What the fuck was that has come out of semi-retirement, which it only ever does when the right-wing banana bread heads are up to some new tomfoolery, which they are, and it will come as no surprise to you that I have opinions about it. About what? Oh, nothing much. Just people out there dictating the right way to be a woman. Laying out all the rules, as it were. Some of these rules are literal laws, and we will get to that, but even more popular right now are social and familial dictates. Pretty much all of us saw this one making the round a few weeks ago.
Your man needs an attractive wife. Why is it so many times that women, after they get married, let themselves go? A hockey player said, he said, I married a trophy wife, but now she looks like the Stanley Cup. You see what I'm talking about? That's what I'm talking about.
Yo, ladies, when God said be fruitful and multiply, he didn't mean multiply your belt size. Hey, yo! Tragically, there is just nothing easier than manipulating women by attacking their self-esteem. Conservatives are always trying to control women and to foster a culture of female inferiority. This putting women in their place is a major goal for patriarchists. But in addition to being an end in itself, it is also a means to other ends. Misogyny is a gateway drug for the alt-right, according to Media Matters, as quoted by Susan Faludi in the latest edition of her book, Backlash. For insecure men, it's like they try a little of that misogyny, and they're like, yeah, that gives me the good feels in my white cis het balls. And their buddies are like, hey, if you liked that, you should snort a line to this racism. And they do that, and they're like, pardon my pantomiming, I don't do coke. They're like, oh, shit, man, that's the stuff. And their buddies are all like, yeah, man, you like that? Take an injection of this fascism. You can tell. That's the sound effect it makes. I do so much drugs, as you can tell. And they're like, oh, yeah, give me some more of that, because it's addictive. And that's how you get hooked on fascism, more or less. This was echoed by Aja Roman in a 2018 Vox article about the alt-right. Roman writes that while the movement is most frequently described in terms of their self-stated, explicit white supremacy, for many of its members, the gateway drug that led them to join the alt-right in the first place was not racist rhetoric, it was sexism. extreme misogyny, evolving from male bonding gone haywire. Turns out that women are not the only people whose insecurities make them vulnerable to dangerous messages. Exploiting the insecurities of men is a great way to turn them into monsters. This is why you never stop hearing sexist rhetoric from the right, and every form of it needs to be paid careful attention, even the stuff that does not seem so bad on its surface. One classic way for misogyny to fly under the radar is for it to come out of the mouth of a woman. It is relatively easy to condemn a male pastor for spewing bullshit about how women should be, but if similar messages come from, say, a female beauty YouTuber or a female author, then it becomes harder to condemn those messages. Just by calling out other women at all, we run the risk of being considered misogynists ourselves. And then there's all the voices that say, stop female infighting. Sometimes those voices make a good point. However, if a fellow woman is spewing bullshit, I will not back off from calling her out just because she's a fellow woman. This women spewing bullshit at other women thing, trying to dictate the right way to be a woman, is at an all-time high thanks to the internet and the backlash to feminism that has been going on in the US since at least 2016. Here and now, I am calling it out. Not just because it annoys me, not just because personally I want all these smug assholes to stop trying to tell me the right way to be a woman and to take themselves and their church lady superiority.
I'm sure you'll all agree I'm just a little bit superior to all of thee. Okay, hit it, Pearl.
And dance right off the side of a bridge. Not just because of that, but also because these right-wing anti-feminists and their regressive messages need to be countered by all of us. They set the women's movement back, and as I will show you, they can actually set people on the path to joining right-wing fringe movements. We are going to be talking about womanhood for most of this episode, but if you are a man or an NB, then this is about you too. Most of the world still thinks of gender as binary, immutable, and mutually exclusive. Men and women are therefore defined in terms of each other, and anyone who cannot fit into one box or the other is just deemed invalid. The purpose of all of this conservative bullshit rhetoric, whether it's about bringing back traditional womanhood or the flip side, bringing back manly men, all of it is narrowly defining each gender and erasing people who are trans or non-binary. It is therefore no surprise that men like Ben Shapiro or the late Rush Limbaugh, both of whose audiences are mostly male, will have so much to say about womanhood.
Yeah, you effin', with some wet-ass P-word, bring a bucket and a mop for this wet-ass P-word. Give me everything you got for this wet-ass P-word. I mean, a bucket and a mop? This sounds like there's something that is going on here that is not biologically normal.
Equally unsurprising is how women like Abby Shapiro and the sisters from Girl Defined, both of whose audiences are mostly female, will have so much to say about manhood.
I don't find Harry Styles in a dress attractive. And this is something that kind of became part of the joke, is that people were saying, oh my gosh, Harry Styles in a dress is just my type. He looks so handsome. He looks so great. No. Incorrect. As somebody who loves the fact that my husband is a man and is masculine, seeing a man in a dress doesn't really do it for me. I'm gonna be honest. The thing about it is that I think that masculinity is actually really important. I think that men need to embrace the best parts of masculinity, right?
As far as people like that are concerned, there is no room for you in the world if you are LGBTQ+. All this is there under the surface whenever these conservative pundits are flapping their jaws about the role of women. Whenever someone is trying to tell us how to be nice ladies, the agenda to erase LGBTQ+ people and suppress any non-traditional expressions of masculinity and femininity is right there, just barely hidden. Authority figures pontificating about how to woman correctly is hardly new. This has been part of our oral and written traditions forever. It's in the Bible. It's in classic films such as My Fair Lady. There have been newspaper columns like Ms. Manners and so on and so on. These days, however, with internet broadcasting and social media, Basically, the floodgates are open for every random nitwit with an opinion to talk as much as they want. Oh, hey. Yeah, that would include me, wouldn't it? At least I'm on the side that isn't killing civilization. Have you been out there lately? We seem to be in a period of increasing backlash to feminism, which is a familiar place for our society to be. Backlash to feminism and definitely backlash to trans identityism. This warrants further exploration, and so we will do very shortly. Hand in hand with suppression of feminism is the policing of women's identity, and that is hugely concerning. There is social policing, which is both popular and profitable at the moment, especially on the internet. I discovered that there is a name for this phenomenon, the influencer economy. Just make content, have it become popular, gain lots of followers, and you make lots of money. That reminds me, please hit like and subscribe on this show, please and thank you. For reasons that we will discuss in a bit, right-wingers have an edge in the influencer economy, but even more so in times of increased anti-feminism. Currently, there are lots of womanhood police trying to get in on the influencer economy. I want to talk about what's funny about them because there's plenty to make fun of. I also want to talk about what they do that is not at all funny and in fact is very concerning. Related to the media phenomenon and even more significant is the political and legal policing of women and womanhood. We will eventually get there, but first I want to elaborate on the idea that feminism and the movement for women's rights has been in decline for some time now. I cannot speak for everywhere in the world, but as an American, that is what I see going on here. If you are watching or listening from a country where women just have it going on, maybe you're having relations with bees like in this photo here. I think that's a reference to Bee Movie. I haven't seen it. I don't mean literally this image, but if you live somewhere where you already have the future that liberals want, please let me know and then marry me so I can move there. But I digress. You might be wondering how women's rights could possibly be regressing in the year 2021, a full century after women's suffrage. Doesn't time equal progress for civil rights movements? As it turns out, no, they're not linear. As Susan Faludi wrote in Backlash, an accurate charting of American women's progress through history might look more like a corkscrew tilted slightly to one side. Its loops inching closer to the line of freedom with the passage of time, but like a mathematical curve, approaching infinity, never touching its goal. Wow, that's deep. Yeah, most things in the universe are cyclical, and so it is with feminism. The first edition of Backlash came out in 1991, and it's all about how after the rise of women's lib in the 1970s, there was a pretty much complete reversal in the 1980s. During that decade, feminism was being blamed for everybody's problems. Not earning enough to pay your rent? Feminism. Stress levels through the roof? Feminism. Too tricky to rock a rhyme that's right on time? Feminism.
There you go again.
Of course, during the 80s, we had Ronald Reagan in the White House, and that didn't help. He was the first U.S. president who came out publicly against abortion, and he tried to appoint justices to the U.S. Supreme Court who would overturn Roe v. Wade. Unfortunately, he chose people who were too reasonable. O'Connor and Kennedy. So, as we would see with successive Republican presidents, when the time came to find new Supreme Court justices, they would just have to go further and further into the banana breadhead forest. And now we have Amy fucking Coney Barrett, cult member. According to Backlash, feminism and quote-unquote women's equality have been blamed throughout history for problems, both real and imagined. In 2020, a new edition was published with a preface about how the Trump era was a whole new backlash against women's rights. You lived through it, so you know. In 2016, most of the American electorate did not find it worthwhile to go to the polls at all and vote for what would have been our first woman president. Most people just stayed home, and most white women voters who were not college educated chose Trump. As a direct result, women's reproductive freedom decreased, and the freedoms we do have now are in jeopardy again. Hundreds of laws have been enacted across the U.S., limiting access to abortion and even limiting access to information about abortion. Availability of different forms of birth control has declined, and research into new forms of birth control is at a standstill. At the same time, income inequality in the U.S. is worse than it has ever been, at least for the last 100 years or so, and possibly longer. Coincidence? When you look at the historical patterns, there really seems to be a strong connection between times of increased poverty and times when feminism falls out of popularity. It makes sense that the first would cause the second. Just think about how resentments naturally boil to the surface when we as people have things taken away from us. Men in our culture grow up absorbing misogynist messages, and actually so does everyone. When work opportunities dry up and competition is at an all-time high, people start to get more hateful. And who are the usual targets? Women, minorities, immigrants. Remember the roaring 1920s? Yeah, me neither, but I've seen The Untouchables, not the movie, but the series. Not the original series, but the reboot from the 90s. It was my favorite show. I was the only person in the world who watched it. Despite prohibition, the 20s were a time of increased freedom. Women cut their hair shorter, they cut their dresses way shorter, they went a-clubbing and did funky dances to jazz music. Ian Harvey wrote a detailed article about this for the Vintage News in 2016. It says that the 1920s gave rise to a highly progressive attitude in fashion, but then came the 1930s and the Great Depression, during which time, Harvey writes, the progressive female fashion of the 20s was suppressed. Skirts, sleeves, and hairstyles got longer again, and so things would remain until the end of World War II. In fact, the U.S. would remain fairly conservative until well into the Vietnam War, which, by the way, we were in for 14 years. 14 fucking years. And the Vietnamese were in it for 20. I just cannot imagine. I mean, that's a long fucking war. But anyways, the women's liberation movement started in the late 1960s and reached its peak in the 1970s. Then the tide turned again. 1979 somehow was just the year that kept on giving for right-wingers all over the world. Ruhollah Khomeini came to power in Iran, Margaret Thatcher came to power in the UK, and...
There you go again.
Okay, technically Ronald Reagan was not yet the president of the United States in 1979, but he was getting there. In the 80s, we had a conservative backlash to the 70s. I do believe the drinking at work turning point came sometime very early in the 1980s. Remember when people used to drink at work? Especially if they had their own office? Every TV show portraying an office, there would be a mini bar in there. and remember 3 martini lunches? Yeah, me neither, because I was 3 years old. But 40 years ago, people drank on their lunch breaks and it wasn't even a thing. No need for that bullshit about it being 5 o'clock somewhere. It only had to be noon. But shit got serious in the 80s. LSD is out, cocaine is in, the drug that lets people work all night, because Reagan and his dastardly trickle-down economics full-on wrecked the American middle-class way of life.
Everybody has 3 mortgages nowadays.
But at 19%, you didn't even bargain with the guy.
Ray, for your information, the interest rate alone for the first 5 years comes to $95,000.
As I mentioned a bit earlier, the 80s were also a time of backlash to feminism, and this is documented extremely well in Backlash by Susan Faludi. After the 80s, you may remember, if you are old enough, that we had a tech boom in the 1990s, followed by the burst of the dot-com bubble and an economic recession, and the election, or perhaps the more accurate term is the installation, of President George W. Bush.
But I'm the decider.
Any doubts on the part of mainstream America with regard to just how far backwards into conservatism they wanted to go after the 90s were blasted away on September 11th, 2001. After that, it was all flag-waving and racism and xenophobia and suppressed feminism. You'll never guess who wrote about this. If you guess Susan Faludi in the new edition of Backlash, you're correct. And bonus points if you also guess Susan Faludi in her subsequent book called The Terror Dream. There she writes, quote, "Long before the towers fell, conservative efforts to roll back women's rights had been making inroads, and the media had been issuing periodic pronouncements on the death of feminism. In part, what the attack on the World Trade Center did was foreground and speed up a process already underway, end quote. Faludi also writes in The Terror Dream that as soon as the terrorist attacks happened, literally on the day of, reporters started calling her, looking for quotes about the state of feminism. Somehow they were all working on pieces confirming the death of the women's movement. Faludi says that one female writer at the New York Observer did an article saying women will now regret their independence and devote themselves to baking cookies and finding husbands to take care of them. Ann Coulter chimed in as well in case you were waiting for her. Check that off on your anti-feminist bingo card. Coulter, as usual, wrote a bunch of bullshit that's far too dumb for her to possibly believe herself. She published a piece in December of 2001 titled Women We'd Like to See in Burqas. And there she wrote that when America is threatened from the outside, men are ascendant and Republicans have a lock on the White House, while petulant feminists complain about guns and patriarchy. And then she goes on to jokingly threaten violence against New York Times reporters and their families. You may also remember that the early 2000s were a pretty bad time economically. I started law school in the fall of 2002, knowing that people who had recently come out of law school were not having a lot of luck finding jobs. One thing I also noticed while in law school was that professors and distinguished alumni and folks like that would present this very bright picture for us about how the profession was diverse and the way it had been paved for women and people of color and LGBTQ plus people and so on and so forth. But I saw something very different when I actually was out in the field. I remember going to sit in one time at a session of the California Court of Appeal in Sacramento. I believe it was a required assignment for one of my classes. It was very fun. The courthouse was super fancy and stuff. Everything was super formal. As a glimpse into my possible future, it was awesome. However, I noticed that virtually every attorney appearing before the court was a white dude. Where had all the diversity gone in the upper echelons of law practice? As it turns out, there is a very high attrition rate in the legal profession. It's just too much of a rat race for a lot of people. And women, more than any other group, tend to drop out and go look for a career that's less stressful and soul-stealing. Oh, hi! Yeah, that's what I did. This phenomenon cannot be fairly blamed on any anti-feminist backlash of the early 2000s because it has been going on in the world of lawyers pretty much since they started allowing women into law schools. However, increased inequality between women and men was a thing being noticed at the turn of the new millennium. It seemed like women increasingly were being relegated into old roles. In November of 2001, Jan van Valkenburg wrote a piece for the Christian Science Monitor titled, Are Women Being Relegated to Old Roles? It documents how in the aftermath of 9/11, women were all but invisible. In the media, we would see female news anchors and widows, but not women serving in leadership positions or being called in as experts. Harvard Business School professor Rosabeth Moss Kanter is quoted in the article saying, Media do not draw on women experts as voices of authority enough, and this affects the public's impression of who can lead in wartime. There's more in there, such as how war causes regression in female autonomy and the roles women are expected to perform. It's a good read. The link, of course, is in the show notes. So, feminism rises and falls in cycles, and it would seem that cultural forces throughout history have shaped the mold that women are expected to fit into. These influences, policing womanhood, are pretty much all conservative as far as I can tell, but unlike so many other conservative areas, here there is ample female representation. I don't know about you, but when I think of the historical female face of conservative influencing, I think of Phyllis Schlafly.
I helped to invent the conservative movement before any of you were around in 1964.
Conservative icon Phyllis Schlafly died on Monday after losing a battle with cancer. She was 92 years old. Mrs. Schlafly was the president of the Eagle Forum, a conservative group with a strong focus on social issues that she founded in 1972.
When she got active back in the very early 1970s, the Equal Rights Amendment was a foregone conclusion. It was going to pass. It passed both houses of Congress, and was racing through the states. Phyllis Schlafly raised up a network of volunteer women across the country, state by state by state, and those women, those volunteers, stopped the Equal Rights Amendment.
Mrs. Schlafly staunchly opposed feminism, but despite her defense of women in traditional roles, she herself was an accomplished academic and a prolific writer. She was politically active until the end of her life, recently pledging her support for presidential nominee Donald Trump.
Because we have the best conservative platform we've ever had, and he endorses it. He will stand by it. He is a real conservative, and I ask you to support him.
In a statement, Mr. Trump said Mrs. Schlafly was a conservative icon who led millions to action, reshaped the conservative movement, and fearlessly battled globalism and the kingmakers on behalf of America's workers and families. She died among family at her home in St. Louis and is survived by 6 children, 16 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren.
Phyllis Schlafly has gotten historical credit for single-handedly defeating the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. I don't know if it's 100% true, but her corpse can fucking molder in the ground as far as I'm concerned. Schlafly is one of the most famous examples of a woman suppressing feminism. A woman who, by the way, was very liberated herself, going out and having this huge career while she was telling all other women to do the opposite. There are so many examples of other women like that, so many more than we have time for on this show. Dear Abby, anyone? There's a piece of Americana for you. The Dear Abby newspaper advice column started in 1956 and is still running. It was started by Pauline Phillips, writing under the pen name Abigail Van Buren. The first name Abigail is a reference to the biblical Abigail from the book of Samuel, who was supposedly a very wise woman, someone who really knew God's law and gave people lots of advice, and according to the Bible, everyone loved her. Because doesn't everyone just love that church lady who knows everything and always tells you what to do? That makes just about as much sense as everything else in the Bible. Dear Abby's last name, Van Buren, is supposedly an homage to President Martin Van Buren, the 8th U.S. president, as we all know from the gang sign for the Van Buren boys in Seinfeld. As for why she chose to name Dear Abby after President Van Buren, there doesn't seem to be any specific reason other than Pauline Phillips thinking it sounded vaguely aristocratic. Incidentally, Pauline had an identical twin sister named Esther who started the advice column called Ann Landers. Don't ask me how that name came about. Both of them eventually were syndicated in pretty much every Sunday paper in America, and they probably still are, even though they are both deceased, and other people are now giving the advice, using the same fake names. If any of you actually read a newspaper these days, let me know if those columns are still in there or not. Point being, Dear Abby is a cultural icon, and the advice, at least in the old days, can be described as insanely sexist. For instance, here are some examples from an article called This Dear Abby Advice is Insanely Sexist by Therese O'Neill from The Week, published in August of 2016. In the first sample column, Dear Abby says it is a woman's fault if her husband cheats. Granted, the column is from around 1960, but still, here's the quote. A protracted extramarital affair means one of two things. Either he is searching for something that is lacking in his marriage, or he is escaping from something that there's been too much of. In other words, if your husband is cheating, then it is because you, wife, are either too much or not enough. So what other option does your husband have but see someone behind your back? The column then goes on to warn wives that when they discover their husbands have been cheating, they had better not nag or make an angry scene over it, or he will just cheat more. The right way to handle it is to sit your husband down and calmly ask, Sweetheart, where have I let you down? You know, free him from any consequences and then hope that his behavior changes anyway. What could possibly go wrong? Dear Abby also says this in a column from around the same time. The so-called emancipated woman who regards her marriage as one of those 50-50 deals is weakening her own marital security. As a husband's sense of obligation is diluted, so is his sense of responsibility to his family. He feels less bound to stick with his wife and children through trials and unpleasantness. So if your marriage is an equal partnership, your man won't feel obligated to stick around. And what woman doesn't want her husband staying with her out of obligation? O'Neill's article contains additional examples from Dear Abby, so check it out. The link is in the show notes. I may forget to say that for every source, but the link is always in the show notes. This stuff is very exemplary of 1950s American mainstream culture, and a lot of baby boomers who grew up in the 50s still have those attitudes. Ask me how I know. I'll tell you. I was raised by 2 boomers. Well, technically my mom's not a boomer since she wasn't born in the U.S. and her parents did not participate in World War II, but she grew up in Israel and there's lots of sexism there because of the Bible. But that's for another show. Hey, speaking of boomers talking about a woman's place, I can think of a media personality who had an influence like America never saw before and hopefully will never see again. They weren't even a woman.
Welcome to the Rush Limbaugh program, a program exclusively designed for rich conservatives and right-minded Republicans and those who want to be either or both.
I have to talk about Rush Limbaugh because he shaped conservative opinions on fucking everything starting in the 1980s. He died on February 17th, 2021 at the age of 70, and I was glad for the world to be rid of him. Limbaugh was a radio DJ, which apparently was all he ever wanted to be since his teens. He was born into a line of rich and well-connected lawyers who were also named Rush Limbaugh. Radio Rush was the third. His father, Rush II, was one of the most rich and powerful people in town, but was apparently home every night of the week in time to watch the 6 o'clock news and shout at the liberals. That would be unheard of for a big, important lawyer these days. Different time, I guess. Rush III, on the other hand, was not the book-learning kind. You know, exactly like so many other people who claim to know everything about everything. He was never one for reading. His parents wanted him to go to college, so after high school, he enrolled at Southeast Missouri State University, where he flunked everything and dropped out after 2 semesters. That's according to his mother, who said Rush just didn't seem interested in anything except radio. Using his family connections, because pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is only for other people, Rush became a full-time DJ, floating from station to station, yada yada yada, town to town, up and down the dial. For about 12 years, in 1984, he took over for Morton Downey Jr. on KFBK Sacramento. Morton Downey Jr. was, well, let's just take a slight tangent and address him since he was in some sense a proto-Rush. This clip is from CNN.
Wants to take your house.
Before Bill O'Reilly.
Want to know what I was doing? Shut up.
Before Glenn Beck.
America, socialism is coming and it's time to wake
Go
up.
straight to hell.
There was Morton Downey Jr.
As you're going to find out in the weeks, months, and years ahead, certain things really burn my buns.
His self-titled show premiered in 1987 with conservative, abrasive talk, foreshadowing the likes of Rush Limbaugh and Jerry Springer.
If I had a slime like you in the White House, I'd puke on you.
Downey Jr. was a shock jock and a right-wing cringe lord. Above all, he was super anti-choice. He once organized a whole anti-choice rally in Sacramento, California. In 1984, he left his radio job at KFBK after causing a kerfuffle when he referred to a local Asian American politician he didn't like as a Chinaman. For this, he was either fired or he quit, depending on who you believe. And he got his own TV show. Rush Limbaugh, anxious as he was, just slid right into that empty radio slot at KFBK, where he became a smash hit due to the number of conservative assholes populating the greater Sacramento area. He pulled triple the audience size that Morton Downey Jr. had. And then things got really interesting thanks to Ronald Reagan.
There you go again.
In 1987, Reagan's FCC repealed the broadcasting rule known as the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine required stations to provide free airtime for people to be able to respond to any controversial opinions that were broadcast. So if stations had shock jocks spewing bullshit, they would also have to let the other side be heard. And if you were someone as full of shit as Rush Limbaugh, that was bad. Luckily for Rush, as of August 5th, 1987, stations could broadcast editorial commentary without having to present opposing views. As stated in a Wall Street Journal editorial by Daniel Henninger, Ronald Reagan tore down this wall, and Rush Limbaugh was the first man to proclaim himself liberated from the East Germany of liberal media domination. Yes, liberal media and Soviet East Germany, exactly the same and not at all different. Right about the time when Barack Obama replaced George W. Bush as president, Democrats started talking about possibly reinstating the Fairness Doctrine. Republicans were not interested. Oklahoma Republican Senator James Inhofe said, for example, that he couldn't think of anything worse than government being able to dictate the content that should be on public radio. Interesting, since they're always going on about the liberal media. But Inhofe said it should be market-driven and leftist shows fail because no one listens to them. Ah, the market, the free market, you know, that thing that public radio is a part of? Oh wait, it isn't. There are so many things wrong with what Inhofe said, but I don't have all damn day to pick it apart, and neither do you. I'm just going to let Fox News have their say, and then you can reach your own conclusion. This is from 2009.
There are renewed calls for a resurrection of what's called the Fairness Doctrine, a regulation requiring balance in the treatment of political issues. But opponents say it is anything but fair. Correspondent Molly Henneberg tells us who's doing the talking and what's being said.
Some Democrats and liberal radio talk show hosts, such as Bill Press, say the government needs to bring back a 1940s policy on broadcast content.
Is it time to bring back the Fairness Doctrine?
I absolutely think it's time to be bringing accountability to the airwaves.
Michigan Democratic Senator Debbie Stabenow, whose husband, Tom Athens, is and has been an executive at various liberal radio talk groups, says she expects hearings at some point on the Fairness Doctrine. It was a policy abolished in 1987 requiring broadcast stations to provide opposing views on controversial issues. But Oklahoma Republican Senator James Inhofe says radio programming should be based on what brings in listeners and advertisers.
I can't think of anything worse than have government in a position to dictate the content of information going over public radio. The whole idea is it has been market-driven.
Inhofe and other critics believe those pushing to bring back the Fairness Doctrine, nicknamed the Hush-Rush Doctrine, want to diminish the influence of Rush Limbaugh and other conservative talk show hosts. Supporters insist that's not the case.
And we're not going to take any of the conservative voices off the airways, but just make sure there are a few progressives or liberals out there. Right?
Exactly, and that's why we need the Fairness Doctrine back.
During the presidential campaign, a spokesman said then-Senator Barack Obama did not favor reinstating the Fairness Doctrine. But his White House spokesman has since left the door open.
I pledge to you to study up on the Fairness Doctrine so that one day I might give you a more fulsome answer.
Considering that 8 out of the top 10 national radio talk programs, such as Laura Ingram's show, have conservative hosts, Senator Inhofe says Democrats and liberal advocacy groups aren't going to let the matter drop.
They are committed to make this happen, and so we've got to be ready.
Inhofe introduced a bill this year to prevent round 2 of the Fairness Doctrine, but he says so far he cannot get one Democrat to co-sponsor it. Brett?
So what about that point they make that conservative snark sells? Rush Limbaugh, Laura Ingraham, Don Imus, those are some of the biggest names in radio. Can you think of any leftist counterparts with as much clout? It's undeniable that right-wing propagandists get a lot of attention. I mean, I was just watching John Oliver's recent segment about Tucker Carlson. We can't stop talking about people like that. The public listens to these clowns either to agree or to get enraged. The left does not tend to reproduce that effect. Far fewer people get enraged when leftists talk. The Koch brothers get enraged. The Vatican gets enraged. Most of the public doesn't tend to find ideas such as universal health care and guaranteed living income overly frightening. So yes, if you let the invisible hand of the free market control broadcasting, the result is likely to be more right-wingers dominating the airwaves and lying without having to worry about being fact-checked. What better argument against unregulated capitalism in broadcasting could there be? Anyway, we were talking about Rush Limbaugh, who was greatly enabled by the repeal of the FCC Fairness Doctrine. In 1988, Rush had become so successful that WABC New York brought him on. Then in the early 90s came the biggest gift Rush ever got. Hey y'all, this is Future Sharon. I'm just going to give you some context for the clip you're about to hear because it's a little confusing. This is from Rush Limbaugh's show in October of 1992, where he decided to screw around with his audience and get them riled up, thinking that he is jumping ship from President George H.W. Bush and is instead going to give his vote to Bill Clinton. He gets angry callers who argue with him until they realize he's fucking with them. It's just satirical brilliance from the comedy gold you expect out of Rush Limbaugh. Sit back and take a listen.
Phyllis in the Bronx in New York, hello.
Hello, my name is Phyllis.
Yes, ma'am.
I am a conservative, and I back my president 100%. I work for the Board of Ed. I am homesick today, but now I'm really sick. Rush, what are you doing to us? I'm sick and tired of the liberals in this country who are pushing our buttons.
What are you talking about?
I mean, you're backing You're backing Bill Clinton.
I am not. I am.
You just said you're backing.
I never said that.
You said you are going to change your vote. You're not voting for the president. You're going to have to vote for Bill Clinton.
I did not say that. I did not say that I was going to.
What did you say?
I did not say that I was going to vote for Bill Clinton.
But I heard you say those words.
No. You're just trying to twist my words and turn them around. I never said it.
What did you say? Could you just tell me? You said you couldn't. You know, I can't even talk. I'm so upset. I'm practically ready for tears.
Look, I don't know. You keep wanting to look in. Look. All I can tell you is I'm tired of it. Everybody wants to look into my past.
No.
All anybody. At your past. It was 23 minutes ago. You keep talking about something that happened 23 minutes ago. It's irrelevant. Can't we move on with things that matter?
You said about changing your entire conservative view?
Can't we talk about the things that you keep wanting to say what I said 23 minutes ago? It doesn't matter.
It does. You said it all over the country.
I didn't say it.
Everybody all over the country.
I was younger 23 minutes ago. Cut me some slack.
No.
I did. You know, this is the kind of, we're trying to move forward. We've got some things that are important that we've got to do on this radio show, and you want to talk about something that happened 23 minutes ago.
That's right, because it's very relevant.
It is not.
We are 2 weeks away from the election. You are talking to the entire country, and the entire country is listening to you, who has been our leader, the one we looked up to for everything. Now you're telling us I can't go with Mr. Bush.
I never said that. I did not say that you can't go with Mr. Bush. You can go with Mr. Bush. I hope you do.
I am going with Mr. Bush.
I think everybody should.
And just at this moment, when the industrial production in the country is on the upswing, labor figures are up, I mean, people are really starting to get it back together again. We need to vote for Mr. Bush. He needs us now. He needs our support more than ever.
Let me tell you something. I couldn't agree with you more. Where have you been? That's exactly the point that I have been making. You think that stuff. You know that stuff because of me, because of this show, because I'm the one that has told you how good things are. I've told you how things aren't bad. I've told you how there's reason to be optimistic because you live in the United States of America. And you call here and you give me grief about something I never even said.
Oh, you know, Rush, I know what I heard. I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you. I listen to you every chance I get.
Well, you're the
guru of the conservatives.
You're going to have to listen a little bit more closely, Phyllis, and you're going to have to think about the future. What happens in the past is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. You mean you're talking about my character when you are challenging something I've said 23, 25 minutes ago, you're talking about my character. My character doesn't matter to anything.
The Clintons were a gold mine for Rush. He would not get an opportunity to hate monger like that again until the U.S. elected a black president. If you are not aware of the effect that Rush had on his fans, talk to someone whose parents used to listen to him. On the Behind the Bastards podcast, they recently did a two-parter on Rush Limbaugh with Paul F. Tompkins. It's very good. I recommend it. One of those guys, and I can't remember which one, described listening in the car with his parents when he was a kid, and the parents just thought Rush was like a prophet, infallible. I challenge anyone to deny that Limbaugh drove right-wingers further right and inspired American fascism. His indoctrination of conservative Americans primed them over a long period of time to be accepting of Donald Trump as a presidential candidate and to respond positively to Trump's toxic personality and speech. Because Rush Limbaugh had toxic personality and speech. In the week following Rush Limbaugh's death, CNN published an op-ed by Nicole Hemmer called "The Man Who Created President Donald Trump." Hemmer says that right-wing media propped up Donald Trump, which we all know, and Rush Limbaugh's show was the most important part of that. Not only was Limbaugh an ardent supporter of the Trump presidency, but just as importantly, Limbaugh spent 3 decades prior to that using his show to lay the groundwork. He blended his knowledge of audio entertainment with his conservative politics, creating a new format that, in Hemmer's words, wrapped right-wing political talk in humor and satire. I guess some people found him humorous. I never did. It's a saying in the comedy world that conservatives are bad at being funny. I agree. And I don't think it's because the status quo cannot be made fun of. I mean, that was Jerry Seinfeld's whole thing. Did you ever notice how all the time there are people who stand too close to you when they talk? You can totally make fun of the status quo, but right-wing political comedians, I don't know. They do so much punching down, that's part of it. And then I think perhaps they don't have places to pull from for good material. Comedy often comes from suffering, turning the cries into laughs, you know. People who are status quo warriors aren't crying because they think the status quo is great. Or maybe they pretend to think the status quo is fine, but really that's not what they think, in which case their comedy is coming from inauthenticity, and that's bad. There's my take on conservative comedians. Hemmer's piece discusses how Limbaugh changed the Republican Party all while he made millions of dollars. He published 2 best-selling books in the early 90s. From 92 to 96, he did a syndicated TV show produced by Roger Ailes. There's a Match Made in Heaven. Roger Ailes is a sexual harasser of women, and Rush Limbaugh was a big defender of sexual harassment of women. He once said that liberals despise human nature if they have a problem with catcalling and objectification of women. He said men should complain. They should walk up to women and say, "Will you please ask your breasts to stop staring at my eyes?" Class act. So many people hung on this guy's every word. And so Republican politicians lined up to get on his show. In 1994, when the Republicans took over the House of Representatives in a landslide election, some of them openly said that they owed it to Rush Limbaugh. However, by elevating Limbaugh, Republicans also elevated the particular type of politics that would become the core of their party. Limbaugh was a shock jock who would compete with other shock jocks to be the most outrageous. He would say hateful things about women, poor people, homeless people, people with AIDS, and of course, people of color. Content warning. I'm about to play for you Limbaugh saying racist things and then playing a racist song called Barack the Magic Negro. I will only play a little bit.
And this next bite, this is at the National Urban Network. Obama says that he shouldn't get black votes just because he's black.
I should not get the support of the African-American community simply because I'm African-American. I don't believe in that. That is not what America
Well, you better change your attitude, because Hillary certainly thinks that. I mean, that's exactly what Hillary thinks. I guess they've patched it up, folks. I guess Sharpton and Obama patched it up since Obama showed up at Sharpton's big whoop.
Barack the Magic Negro lives in D.C. The L.A. Times, they called him that 'cause he's not authentic like me.
Yeah, that's enough of that. Limbaugh, just like Trump does now, would deflect criticism by saying stuff like, oh, it's just a joke, you don't get my humor. As Hemmer put it, that kind of just kidding racism and misogyny, aimed at providing plausible deniability, has become a staple of conservatism today. Hemmer goes on to note that Limbaugh built a cult of personality that elevated loyalty above all else. Sound familiar? By the 2000s, Republican politicians could not afford to cross him. In 2012, when Limbaugh called Georgetown law student Sandra Fluke a slut for advocating for contraception coverage, Republicans could only hint at vague criticisms if they didn't want to lose their whole base. Mitt Romney was running for president that year, and when he was asked about women's issues and the terrible things Limbaugh was saying, Romney knew he could not outright condemn it. All he could say was, well, that's not the language I would have used. I don't know, Mitt, perhaps if those were the words you did use, you would have won the election. Americans do love a good old misogynist, apparently. Hemmer closes the piece by writing, quote, Limbaugh's reliance on insults, nicknames, racism, and misogyny didn't just prefigure the rise of Donald Trump. He created the politics that enabled Trump to rise to power. While much of the rest of the country saw Trump's campaign announcement speech in 2015 as a bizarre mashup of conspiracy theories, racism, and lies, for Limbaugh's listeners, it wasn't so strange. It was, in fact, a manifestation of the hours of radio they listened to each day. And while Limbaugh's show will now go dark, his pernicious influence on media, on politics, and on the precarious state of American democracy will long outlive him. End quote. In other words, Rush Limbaugh taught Republicans to love an angry, racist bully. That is corroborated by a New York Magazine piece by Jonathan Chait titled, Rush Limbaugh Taught Republicans to Love an Angry, Racist Bully. Chait says that the line from Limbaugh to Trump is about an inch long, like both of their dicks. I can stoop low too. Limbaugh found his place sooner than Trump, at a time when a bellicose misogynist could find a valued position in the party, but not as its presidential candidate. However, being a bellicose misogynist and a viable presidential candidate had become a possibility by the time Trump found his way to conservatism as a viable brand. I just love Chait's article. There's so much good stuff. Chait says that Limbaugh oozed bile, did not merely characterize his targets as misguided or stupid or even selfish. He rendered them for his audience as dehumanized targets of rage. He had a special rage for feminist women, a.k.a. castrating harpies, and of course black people. Limbaugh considered black people to be lazy, intellectually unqualified, and inherently criminal. The message he pounded home day after day was that minorities and women were seizing status and resources from white people, and especially white men, and the victory in this zero-sum struggle would go to whichever side fought more viciously. Chait also really hits the nail on the head with regard to Rush's intellect. Remember, Rush was not a book-learning type. Chait says about Rush, quote, he could blather for hours without going from a premise to a conclusion. His only tools for processing opposing points of view were assertion, mockery, and resentment. Limbaugh liked to call himself smart, but he was a lifelong stranger to reason. He hid this weakness with a remarkable ability to gab smoothly and seamlessly, end quote. So in other words, Rush was a mirror image of all your racist relatives. And did he ever resonate with them? People would come to Rush's show for the misogyny and stay for the fascism. Rush also could be crude and obnoxious without losing people, because the crudeness was always directed at targets that the audience also hated. Rush knew how to tap into hate, and I don't know, he knew how to give people some kind of racism and sexism catharsis. Plus, lest we forget, due to the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, Rush was able to gish gallop on air unchallenged. There is no single cause for anything, but the Trump presidency and the rise of the alt-right is very traceable to Rush Limbaugh. Forever in the ground may he fucking molder. Those are words I appropriated from Greg Proops, though he was talking about Ronald Reagan, to whom that also applies. Hey, this is Future Sharon. We are going to leave it there for part 1, since this is another long-ass episode. Please come on back tomorrow for part 2 of this episode, Taking the Pink Pill, The Path to the Alt-Right.